It is just before dawn somewhere in the Philippine Sea. 1943. A column of Japanese transports slices through the dark water, their decks stacked with crates of ammunition, fuel drums, and soldiers bound for distant island garrisons. The rising sun paints a faint silver line across the horizon, but below deck the radios are already crackling. Operators sit with headphones pressed tight, transmitting routine position reports back to headquarters in Tokyo. They believe their numeric codes are unbreakable. They believe the ocean is too vast, too empty, too silent for an unseen enemy to be listening. Nobody on board knows that thousands of miles away in a dimly lit room, filled with cigarette smoke and endless paper strips, U.S. cryptographers are reading those same signals almost as quickly as they are sent. Coordinates, convoy numbers, cargo manifests, all pulled from the air, translated, and forwarded to waiting submarines already adjusting their course. The captains on the transports see nothing. But in the deep Pacific gloom, a periscope lens tilts ever so slightly. The ocean is no longer empty, the convoy is no longer hidden, and the radios they trusted have already betrayed them. Before the first Japanese convoy ever vanished beneath torpedo trails guided by intercepted radio traffic, there was a moment when Japan believed it had mastered the Pacific. The empire had surged outward in 1941 and early 1942 with an almost unstoppable momentum. From Malaya to the Philippines, from Hong Kong to the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces seized territory at a pace that stunned the Western world. Their navy, the once shadowed Imperial Japanese Navy, now roamed the Pacific with an air of dominance that even seasoned U.S. officers had to respect. Behind this sweeping expansion lay a simple truth. Japan's war machine fed on maritime lifelines, oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, tin and manganese from the Dutch East Indies, rice, salt, ammunition, replacement troops, all of it moved by sea. The Empire of Japan had no vast interior resources like the United States or the Soviet Union. If the ships stopped moving, the guns stopped firing. And yet, despite this dependence, Japanese naval doctrine did not embrace a comprehensive convoy protection system in the early war years. For decades before the conflict, Japanese naval planners believed that the best defense for supply ships was the offensive strength of the Imperial Navy itself. Instead of shielding merchant vessels with layered escort formations, they trusted in striking power. Aircraft carriers and heavy cruisers meant to deter enemy incursions simply by their presence. The convoy system, so central to Allied defensive logistics, was considered a sign of weakness. The Japanese mindset equated convoy escort duty with second-rate assignment, something beneath the honor-bound warriors of the Emperor's fleet. There was another assumption that played into this overconfidence: their communications. The Japanese Navy relied on complex coded messages known as JN-25, a multi-layered codebook system involving additive ciphers and substitution groups. Every transmission, from convoy departure signals to logistical updates, passed through this encryption system. With each communication converted into sequences of seemingly random numbers, Japanese officers were convinced that even if the enemy intercepted their traffic, they couldn't possibly read it in time to act on it. They believed the ocean gave them distance. They believed the code gave them silence. They were wrong on both counts. At Pearl Harbor, as Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft roared toward Oahu, small rooms at U.S. naval intelligence stations were already filled with people watching the airwaves. They recorded every Japanese signal they could find, even if they couldn't yet understand them. These men and women, many of them young, many without combat assignments, began collecting fragments of Japanese radio traffic, storing them on long strips of paper, marking patterns, looking for repetition. Back in Tokyo, convoy signals were sent with the usual confidence. Ship names replaced with 3-digit codes, departure times buried under layers of encrypted numerals, routes discussed using reference points known only to Japanese planners. In theory, even if the enemy somehow cracked the code, they would be too late. By the time a convoy position report was deciphered, the ships would be hundreds of miles away. But theory overlooks two things: American persistence and mathematics. Even in the early stages of the war, Japanese convoy commanders ignored repeated warnings from intelligence officers who suspected that Allied radio interception could be more dangerous than assumed. They believed in the myth of distance, the protective cloak of vast ocean space. And because early encounters with U.S. submarines seemed sporadic and disorganized, that belief only strengthened. In naval briefings, Japanese officers repeated a phrase with quiet assurance: "Our codes will hold." At American intelligence stations, in Hawaii, in Australia, even in makeshift decoding huts in the Aleutians, that phrase read like a challenge. The Pacific War would not only be fought with steel and explosives, it would be fought on frequencies, invisible, silent, deadly. And as the convoys steamed forward, the men in the decoding rooms leaned closer to the radios, listening, waiting, turning fragments of static into coordinates that would soon guide torpedoes. Through the waves, the stage was set for a battle, fought without gunfire, long before the first convoy was ambushed by a submarine guided not by chance, but by code. In early 1942, while Japanese forces controlled vast stretches of the Pacific, another operation was unfolding in a very different kind of battlefield, not on islands or seas, but in quiet, windowless rooms where radios crackled like distant thunder. The United States had suffered humiliation at Pearl Harbor, but beneath the shock, a network was forming. A network built not of fleets and armies, but of intercept stations, listening posts, and decoding units known by cryptic designations like Station HYPO, OP-20G, and FRUMEL. These groups, scattered across Pearl Harbor, Melbourne, Corregidor, and later Guadalcanal in Australia, were the ears of the U.S. Navy. They didn't fire torpedoes. They didn't fly bombers. They simply listened. Young mathematicians, former telegraph operators, language prodigies, and a growing number of waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, sat for endless hours, transcribing every Japanese naval signal they could intercept. They captured weather reports, fleet movement communications, coded logistics updates, anything that passed through Japanese frequency bands. To untrained eyes, the intercepted messages were nothing more than endless strings of 5-digit numbers. But to the cryptographers, they were pieces of a living map. At the center of this effort stood Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor. Often seen in a red smoking jacket and sandals, he was not the image of a traditional naval officer, but his mind worked like a steel trap. Day after day, his team pored over the JN-25 code system, identifying recurring patterns, breaking apart additives, reconstructing code groups. Every breakthrough, no matter how small, was pinned to the walls. Still, early on, decrypts came too slowly to be of tactical value. A Japanese convoy could leave port, sail for days, deliver cargo, and return, sometimes before a single decoded message was fully processed. Intelligence officers understood that decrypting messages after the convoys had moved was historically interesting, but tactically worthless. That changed when Rochefort and his analysts devised a faster partial decode system. Instead of waiting to solve the entire message, they began extracting key data points, departure codes, location markers, and reference coordinates hidden inside larger strings. Even a partially decoded message could reveal just enough information to send a submarine hunting in the right direction. Back in Washington, the Office of Naval Communications began routing decrypted fragments directly to Pacific Fleet Headquarters under Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Nimitz, unlike many traditional commanders, treated intelligence as a weapon, not an accessory. He gave Rochefort's team authority to bypass conventional reporting bureaucracy. If an intercept indicated a convoy was moving toward a certain grid square, the information would not be filed for later. It would be transmitted straight to submarine command. This formed the backbone of a wartime intelligence pipeline. Intercept stations captured Japanese communications in raw signal form. Code breakers processed and extracted usable elements from JN-25 messages. Fleet intelligence officers translated coordinates into actionable submarine routes. Submarine captains silently adjusted their course based on radio guidance, often without knowing how their orders were obtained. Over time, U.S. submarines began to appear too consistently in the paths of Japanese convoys. At first, the Japanese attributed this to luck or random patrol patterns. They did not yet understand that their radio signals, which they believed to be encrypted beyond enemy reach, were guiding American torpedoes with increasing accuracy. By mid-1943, The U.S. Navy no longer saw Japanese convoys as elusive targets in a vast ocean. They saw moving coordinates inside an invisible grid, each signal ping marking a path that could be followed. The Pacific was no longer wide and unknowable. It was being mapped in real time by ears that never slept. And as the submarines adjusted their bearings, the first signs of a new kind of warfare emerged, one where a radio transmission could be more lethal than a broadside from a battleship. The Japanese had built their war machine on maritime arteries. The U.S. cryptographers were about to cut them, one convoy at a time. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the war with a deeply ingrained belief: mobility was protection. Instead of structured layered convoy escort formations like those used by the Allies in the Atlantic, Japanese doctrine favored speed, dispersion, and minimal escort allocation. They saw convoys not as strategic lifelines to be shielded at all cost, but as temporary logistical movements beneath the concern of high command. Early in the war, this assumption appeared justified. Allied resistance in the Pacific was scattered. American submarines, plagued by defective torpedoes and inconsistent patrol coordination, achieved only sporadic success. Japanese supply routes from the Dutch East Indies to frontline bases in Rabaul and Truk ran with relative freedom. This early span of success reinforced a fatal belief: the enemy could not see what they could not catch. Convoys often sailed with just one or two destroyers as escort, sometimes not even that. Merchant captains varied in experience, and coordination between ships was inconsistent. Routes were chosen based on efficiency rather than security. Convoys sailed predictable paths, hugging established lanes that intelligence officers could plot and anticipate. Meanwhile, signal traffic increased as logistics demands grew. Every departure, every course correction, every request for fuel, all transmitted over radio. The Allies watched these habits with clinical precision. Each repeated route, each commonly used code group, each recurring transmission pattern became a thread that cryptographers could follow. What the Japanese saw as operational routine, American analysts saw as pattern recognition. The very structure of Japanese convoy strategy, rigid, predictable, lightly escorted, made them vulnerable to an enemy that no longer hunted by sight, but by signal. Japanese commanders still believed in naval superiority through decisive fleet engagement, not quiet protection of merchant traffic. They prepared to fight midway-like battles with carriers and cruisers. Meanwhile, the true war, the slow suffocation of Japanese logistics, would come from beneath the waves. Guided by decoded radio transmissions, JN-25 was considered a marvel of Japanese naval cryptography, a supercode combining codebooks and mathematically generated additives that changed at intervals. Each message was encoded in blocks of numbers, requiring vast effort to break. In theory, it was secure. In practice, it was flawed, not because of its design, but because of how it was used. Japanese operators transmitted frequently, sometimes unnecessarily, and with repeated standard phrases that cryptographers could identify and strip away. Each repetition was a crack in the armor. Furthermore, altered additive tables did not fully change internal structure. Analysts could detect predictable relationships between old and new code sets, creating stepping stones into fresh decrypts. The Japanese believed that message volume and complexity protected them, but in the world of cryptanalysis, volume is fuel. The more messages sent, the more material there was to compare, align, and decode. U.S. stations didn't need to break every message. They only needed fragments. A departure time here, a destination code there. Japanese assumption: if the enemy cannot read it entirely, they cannot act on it. American reality: we don't need it all. We just need enough. At Station HYPO, papers cluttered every surface. Analysts pinned known numerical sequences on boards like hunters tracking prey. Partial decrypts created a growing database of reference markers, codes for specific geographical grid points, common convoy departure symbols, even recurring signatures from certain radio officers whose habits unknowingly betrayed them. Overconfidence in JN-25 meant that Japanese convoy transmissions continued even as losses mounted. Rather than adopting strict radio silence or diversifying encryption, they simply updated additive tables, unknowingly using the very same process that allowed American analysts to continue partial tracking. They believed encryption complexity equaled safety. But the ocean was never the battlefield that mattered. The airwaves were. By 1943, the U.S. Navy recognized what Japanese command still refused to accept. Code breaking had become a weapon. Every intercepted signal was a potential torpedo path. Every decoded coordinate was a threat. And with each message transmitted, the Japanese convoy network tightened the noose around its own lifeline. The Pacific War is often remembered through images of carriers, submarines, and jungle battles. But far from the roar of aircraft engines and the crash of naval gunfire, another war was fought in silent rooms under dim yellow lights. Inside Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, in OP-20G in Washington, in hidden annexes at Brisbane and Melbourne, men and women stared at nothing but paper and static. Their world had no horizon lines, no waves, no enemy formations, and only numbers, fragments, and faint signal tones that crackled like ghosts in the wires. Many of the cryptographers were young, some barely out of college. They did not wear combat ribbons. Some had never even seen a naval ship up close. Yet their work would sink more Japanese shipping tonnage than many frontline combat divisions. A typical shift lasted 12 to 14 hours. Operators recorded intercepts non-stop, transcribing every 5-digit block. Cryptanalysts combed through those blocks searching for patterns. Fingers stained with ink and graphite, they marked combinations that looked familiar. A weather code, a standard phrase, a known operator's rhythm. Each fragment was copied onto paper strips that covered long wooden tables. The work was repetitive, endless, soul-draining, but there were moments. A pause in the air, a sudden realization, when a string of numbers suddenly meant something. A decrypted grid reference, a convoy ID code, a departure signal. In those moments, the silent war advanced more than a fleet could in a month. They would pass those fragments to intelligence officers, who translated them into orders for submarine captains. The cryptographers rarely knew the outcome of their work. They didn't see the torpedo wakes. They didn't watch ships explode in pillars of water. They only saw more numbers arriving, demanding attention. They were thousands of miles from the convoys. Yet without them, no submarine could find its prey. The divide between the two naval commands was not just one of resources, it was one of mindset. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, trusted intelligence even when outcomes weren't immediately proven. He gave Rochefort's team operational relevance, allowing them to issue actionable recommendations without waiting for layers of approval. Every decrypted fragment passed directly into the bloodstream of Fleet Command. Nimitz understood something vital. Information without speed is just trivia. In Tokyo, intelligence officers issued periodic warnings about possible code vulnerability, but traditional naval commanders dismissed such concerns. Japanese naval doctrine prioritized decisive fleet action and direct confrontation. Submarines were not seen as strategic convoy hunters but as tools to support fleet engagements. Protecting cargo ships was viewed as a secondary duty, something to be done only if resources allowed. Even as convoy losses began to increase, some Japanese admirals blamed submarine performance on luck, not intelligence coordination. They believed the Americans lacked the technical capacity to read JN-25. And even if they did, they assumed reaction time would be too slow to matter. The idea that a convoy's fate could be sealed before it even left port, because a message had been decrypted within hours of being sent, was simply not within their strategic imagination. This difference in perception shaped the pace of the war. While Nimitz streamlined the intelligence-to-action pipeline, Tokyo added procedure, skepticism, and delay. U.S. submarines began receiving decode-based patrol orders with remarkable precision. Japanese convoys, still relying on outdated assumptions, continued to broadcast their movements directly into the waiting ears of submarines. The leadership gap was invisible to the men at sea, but it shaped every ambush that would follow. The radio war had set the stage. The convoys were still sailing. The submarines were adjusting course, and soon, the sea would erupt. By late 1943, something had changed beneath the surface of the Pacific. Japanese commanders couldn't see it, couldn't point to it on a map. But they felt it. Convoys were no longer just disappearing by chance. The first shock came quietly. A convoy designated HI-22. carrying fuel bound for the garrisons in the Central Pacific, left Singapore. Radio operators transmitted the departure signal using JN-25, confident it would remain a sealed message. Within hours, Station HYPO flagged a segment of the transmission. The code group matched previously identified patterns tied to convoy departures. In Pearl Harbor, an intelligence officer traced the coordinates. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarine forces, issued an immediate dispatch. The submarine USS Bonefish was ordered to adjust course by just 37 miles, an adjustment based solely on a decrypted snippet barely a sentence long. 2 days later, in the pre-dawn blackness, a sonar ping echoed faintly through Bonefish's hull. On the horizon, a Japanese tanker's silhouette emerged, backlit by the moon. Bonefish fired a spread of torpedoes. Explosions ripped the night open. The convoy scattered, firing flares and dropping depth charges into the darkness. But the damage was done. A tanker filled with thousands of tons of precious fuel that had taken weeks to extract and load, sank beneath the waves in minutes. Tokyo called it bad fortune. It wasn't. It was mathematics. Intelligence. Turns into a weapon soon. American submarines began appearing with uncanny accuracy. Convoys sailing through the South China Sea found submarines positioned at choke points they believed were unknown to the enemy. Japanese captains started zigzag maneuvers, increased lookout shifts, even altered speed intervals. But the submarines kept finding them. At Station HYPO, decrypted fragments piled up faster than ever. Analysts identified new grid coordinate codes. They noticed specific radio officers in the Japanese fleet used slight variations in timing, inadvertently creating recognizable fingerprints in intercepted signals. Submarines began receiving orders like, "Proceed to grid AR-78, expect convoy within 12 hours. Those orders weren't guesses. They were derived directly from Japanese radio traffic, and radio traffic sent under the assumption that distance was safety. In one notable operation, USS Harder and USS Celeon received near-simultaneous intelligence updates from intercept stations. Two separate convoys had departed different ports hours apart. Cryptographers identified their probable intersection points based on partial code decrypts and tide tables. Japanese convoys preferred to pass certain straits at slack tide to avoid strong currents. Using that logic, U.S. command triangulated their routes. Both submarines arrived early. Both convoys were hit. In the aftermath, Japanese escorts radioed frantic reports back to command. The messages, encrypted, confident, were intercepted too. The ocean narrows. To the Japanese, the Pacific was still wide. To American cryptographers, it had become a grid of numbers, a sequence of predicted movements. Convoys that once vanished into the vastness now appeared fixed on invisible coordinates. Submarines no longer patrolled randomly. They stalked expected locations with mathematical certainty. By December 1943, over 60% of successful U.S. submarine attacks were directly triggered by intercepted and decrypted Japanese signals. Convoy commanders noticed a pattern they could not explain. Whenever they reported a location or change of course, hours later a submarine appeared. They issued directives to reduce communication, but logistics demands required constant reporting. Troops needed updates. Port commands demanded confirmation. Tokyo wanted adherence to schedule. Messages kept flowing, and with each transmission, American cryptographers tightened their grip on the Pacific convoy network. The climax of the radio war had begun, and most Japanese officers still didn't realize they were in one. The convoys continued to sail, but whispers of something unseen began to circulate. Ships were being sunk not just at sea, and they were being hunted from the airwaves. By early 1944, the pattern was no longer an anomaly. It was a crisis. Convoys vanished with such frequency that the Imperial Japanese Navy began referring to certain routes as Kuroi Kaidan, the Black Stairway, a grim metaphor used by sailors to describe the feeling of descending step by step toward inevitable destruction. They still watched the horizon for periscopes and aircraft, never understanding that their fate had been sealed the moment a radio operator keyed a transmission. The moment of realization. January 1944, convoy HI-31, heavily loaded with aviation fuel and replacement troops, departed Moji, bound for Singapore. The convoy had 6 transports and 3 escorts, stronger protection than usual. Tokyo issued orders for stricter radio silence, but fuel status reports still needed to be transmitted. Departure confirmation still had to be relayed. Encoding done, messages sent. In Pearl Harbor, the intercept was flagged within 20 minutes. Rochefort's team identified 2 critical code groups, one indicating departure, the second referencing grid sectors that had already been correlated with Japanese convoy lanes. USS Flasher and USS Hake were ordered to converge on a specific coordinate box southeast of Hainan. On January 23, 1944, before sunrise, both American submarines made contact. Torpedoes struck 2 tankers in rapid succession. Black smoke columns rose like towers against the early sky. Survivors watched the submarines dive and disappear before Japanese escorts could even attempt a counterattack. When Tokyo headquarters received word of the losses, their reply was delayed, not because of communication failure, but because officers hesitated. The escorts had reported they were ambushed exactly at the predicted arrival window, in an otherwise empty expanse of sea. That detail made its way up the chain of command. Someone finally asked the question, "How are they finding us?" With such precision? Black Christmas for Japanese shipping. The worst came months later, a period U.S. submarine commanders would later refer to as Black Christmas, though it happened throughout 1944 rather than a single night. During this campaign, dozens of Japanese convoys were systematically destroyed based almost entirely on decrypted signals rather than patrol chants. Convoys, HI-71, Taya-9, MoMA-03, and many others disappeared in flaming trails across the Philippine Sea and the South China Sea. Some convoys were hit twice, once during open passage, again during retreat. Japanese escort captains described a chilling experience in logs recovered after the war. "We changed speed in the night. We took a new course. We did not transmit our change. Yet they were there again, waiting." The Japanese could not fathom that submarines were being repositioned by ongoing intelligence monitoring, not just initial intercepts. Every time a convoy captain broke radio silence to report an adjusted ETA, American cryptographers heard it. Convoys thought they were shedding hunters. Instead, they were guiding them. Freedom of movement turns into a killing. Grid by late 1944, Japanese merchant crews sailed with a new fear. Silence was no longer reassuring. The ocean felt watched. Sailors described the sensation that something unseen was listening. Convoy officers began issuing random course changes without informing higher command, hoping to disrupt whatever unseen force guided the enemy. But in the absence of communication, coordination broke down. Escorts lost formation. Anti-submarine nets became ineffective. Convoys fell into disarray, and submarines exploited every gap. The Pacific, once Japan's strategic shield, had turned into a lattice of invisible tripwires. Every message sent, even a short weather update, pulsed through those tripwires. By the end of 1944, over half of Japan's merchant fleet had been sunk. More than 70% of sinkings were attributed to U.S. submarines. A majority of those submarine actions were directed using decrypted communications. The climax was not marked by a single battle, but by a realization, too late, that the true battlefield had never been the surface of the sea. It had been the airwaves all along. The convoys, once symbols of Japanese industrial power, were now silhouettes sinking in flames across the Pacific. Each one marked first, not by a periscope, but by a line of code intercepted and understood, by someone sitting in a quiet room thousands of miles away. The smoke of burning fuel still hung over the water when intelligence officers in Hawaii logged their next intercept, because the convoys would keep sailing and the radios would keep speaking. By late 1943, reports began flooding into Tokyo. Convoys were vanishing without even sending a distress call. Entire transports disappeared. Supply chains to island garrisons, once steady, were now severed. Starvation, fuel shortages, and ammunition scarcity spread like disease across the Pacific outposts. At first, Japanese commanders blamed American radar. Then they blamed coastal spotters, native islanders aiding the Allies, even air reconnaissance patrols. Not once did they imagine that the Americans were listening to their every word. reading every message, every convoy schedule, every emergency reroute. The reaction inside Imperial headquarters. Meetings turned tense. Logistics officers couldn't explain the losses. Navy staff suspected a leak within their own ranks. Cryptography teams insisted, "Our codes are mathematically unbreakable." Admirals demanded proof, and none could be given. The truth was cruel. Japan was still changing radio call signs and encryption pads, but America was reading them faster than Japan could replace them. By the time Tokyo realized the Pacific was no longer safe to speak across, hundreds of ships had already been sunk. The silence of the sea was an illusion. By late 1944, Japan's once mighty logistical arteries were barely functioning. What had started as a steady stream of supply convoys across the Pacific had been reduced to desperate, fragmented runs across waters now called the American killing grounds by Japanese survivors. Radio discipline in the Imperial Japanese Navy collapsed. Some officers demanded silence, others insisted on coded confirmations. But it no longer mattered. The Americans didn't need to hear every word. They just needed patterns. Every time a Japanese ship sent even a brief transmission, American direction-finding stations triangulated its position within minutes. Submarines already prowling the expected lanes would silently adjust course. Once, convoys could move with the confidence of shadow and distance. Now, movement meant risk, transmission meant exposure, life meant radio silence. On November 7, 1944, a final desperate convoy, Convoy TA-3, departed Manila with troops, medical supplies, and fuel. Its captain ordered absolute radio silence. No signals, no updates, no contact. For 3 days, silence held. But to avoid American aircraft, he altered course slightly, just a few degrees east. As night fell, he broke silence for one transmission. A simple course correction, hurriedly encrypted. It never reached Tokyo. It reached USS Batfish. And in the next 48 hours, one submarine sank 3 Japanese destroyers and 2 transports, using information pulled from a single intercepted signal. When the ocean finally calmed, over 4,000 soldiers and crew were gone, not because they had been seen, but because they had been heard. In the end, the Pacific War was not decided by the largest fleet, nor the heaviest guns, nor the boldest admirals. It was decided by listeners, men in cramped rooms surrounded by static and paper, submarine captains staring through fogged periscopes, waiting for coordinates from a voice they would never meet, radio operators tapping keys unaware that every click was a beacon calling death from beyond the horizon. Japan believed the ocean would hide them. But in a war of steel and fire, it was sound, invisible, weightless, and that proved unstoppable. The last Japanese convoy did not go down fighting. It went down broadcasting. As the screen fades to black, a final line appears: in war, silence is survival. In the Pacific, silence came too late.